Hey pals, I'm here today to film my March reading wrap up. Now I will pre-warn you, the clocks have changed in the UK, so we are getting longer evenings, but it does mean that I'm not quite sure at what time it starts to get dark, and so the light does keep changing. So I apologise if at certain points in this video I'm very cool toned, and then at other points, whilst bathed in sunlight, I'm very warm toned, but you know, this is what we work with. So I read 9 books in March. I actually had a really great reading month. I spent the first week of the month reading a 200-page book that I didn't really enjoy, so it started off badly. But then I picked up a book I enjoyed and then read, I think 4 or 5 books in 9 days, and just sped through them and had such fun reading those books really quickly. And it really inspired me to get back into reading a lot more often, which is something I've not been great at doing in the last year, which is funny when I have a channel like this. But then what happened is in the last week of the month, I've had a lot of stuff going on to do with my work life, which I won't go into here, but I probably will talk about in an upcoming video. And it's been quite stressful, and so I have just not done a lot of reading in the last week. So I had sort of a peak in the middle of the month, but now some of my work issues have been resolved, some, not all. I think I have the brain space again, so I'm hoping to read a lot in April, fingers crossed. So firstly, I've got 3 books of the 9 that I'm not going to talk about loads here for various reasons. The first 2, it's because they are part of a fantasy series, and they are books 4 and 5 in a 5-book fantasy series. So obviously I can't go into the plot at all. So those are Shapers of Darkness and Weavers of War by David B. Coe. These are the 4th and the 5th book in the Winds of the Foreland series. I've been speaking about these books for about a year because that's how long I've been taking to read them. They were recommended by Chris over at Chris's Bookish Cauldron. We have really similar fantasy tastes, so I always take Chris's recommendations, and I'm really glad I did with these. I really enjoyed these. I've given all 5 books 4 stars and would read more books from this author. Very briefly, it is a high, epic political fantasy series. I would say it's sort of like Song of Ice and Fire in terms of how much politics is at the forefront of the books. But what I would say, so my one complaint about this series that stopped me from giving them all 5 stars is that there's 7 countries featured, and you are following the political leaders and their advisors in all these countries. Each book sort of adds another country and more characters. So by the end of the series, there is loads of characters to keep track of. And because of that, you don't get super close to any of them. So A Song of Ice and Fire probably has a similar character count, but each of the books is probably double the length of these because, the mass market paperback, so there's not a ton of words here. And so I almost feel like I'd rather each book was a bit longer and I had more time to really deeply care about all these characters. But other than that, I really enjoyed it. I think the politics is really well written. The sort of suspicion and intrigue is always high. And I think in the final book there's lots of battles in the final book, which isn't something I usually enjoy, but I think he wrote them really well. I think he really got across the fear when you go into hand-to-hand combat, and also the sort of bloodlust that can take over once you're out on the field. The only criticism I had of this sort of final book is there's a couple of sort of character arcs where I thought that the characters' decisions didn't make a ton of sense, but they felt like they were done because it was interesting for the plot. But I enjoyed the rest of the book enough to still give them both 4 stars. So I definitely recommend those books if you're interested in political fantasy. And the next book I'm not going to talk about a lot is because this was my Patreon book club pick for March, so I will be doing a spoilery video over on Patreon where I'll talk about this book in loads of detail, so I don't want to sort of repeat myself here. And that book is I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Mackay. We had 2 books up for the March vote, both of which were new releases, and this one won. I'm really glad it won. I really, really enjoyed this book. This really reminded me how much I enjoy literary fiction books that have an element of crime or something being uncovered. I had such fun guessing when I was reading this book. So the premise of this book is it's set in a boarding school, I think in New England, and in the 90s, a young girl at the school was murdered, somebody was convicted, and now in the present, our protagonist was a student at that school. She was the roommate of the girl who was killed. She's been invited back there to teach some lessons on podcasting. She's a really successful podcaster. And she gets wrapped up in looking back into the crime and, you know, trying to figure out if the right person was convicted. I loved the boarding school vibes. I definitely want to read more boarding school novels, so please feel free to recommend them. I just really enjoyed the intrigue. Thematically, this book's really interesting, all the themes this book is discussing, and I will definitely read more books from this author. So this was a 4-star read for me. Can't wait to talk about it more with my book club. And yeah, that's all I'll say here. Then I'll talk about the book I picked up straight after that because I've been enjoying that so much. And that is Other Woman by Emma Flint. This is Emma Flint's second novel, and I thought Emma Flint was an American writer because her first novel, Little Deaths, was a book based on, I think, a true crime as well, which was set in, I think, 1960s America, and was very much focused on the ways in which sexism at the time would have affected the portrayal of women in the papers when crimes occur. That sounds quite vague, but that's sort of what this book is based on as well. But this book is set in London in the interwar years. This is set about 6 years after World War I, and the author is actually British. So I guess she just was interested in that crime in the US. This is also set up based on a true crime. And this is told from 2 different perspectives. One is a woman who is one of the extra women. So basically, after the First World War, we had a surplus of women of a certain age because of how many men had fought and died in the war. And so a lot of women ended up being viewed as sort of spinsters and were sort of desperate to find somebody to marry because of, you know, what that would mean for them, both financially and sort of prestige-wise. And so you're following this woman who works in an office, and a new man starts at the office, and he is married, and she quite quickly starts an affair with him. So you're following her story, and then you're also following the story from his wife's perspective from the moment she finds out that her husband has been accused of murdering a woman who you very quickly, you know, obviously realise must be this woman he's been having an affair with. So you're getting these 2 perspectives. Let me double check their name. Beatrice is the woman he's having an affair with. So her story gradually works its way up to the point of the crime, and his wife's story works from the point of the crime to the decision by the jury. And in both of their stories, you get more information. This I really enjoyed. I read this in 2 days. I think this is I'm going to call it Sarah Waters light. What I mean by that is this very much reminded me of The Paying Guests, which is a Sarah Waters novel set in a similar time period, also in London, also about a real crime that occurred. And also The Night Watch, which is another Sarah Waters novel set in London just after World War II that has sort of commentary on what war does to a country. So it sort of feels like a blend of those. Not as good, like Sarah Waters is, like, in my mind, one of the best living writers, also the best historical fiction writer. But if this is Emma Flint's second historical fiction novel, I'm very much excited to see where she goes next. Like I said, this gave me lots of Sarah Waters vibes in terms of writing style, the level of detail. Like, I could really picture the rooms they were in, the food, the outfits. It felt very seeped in historical detail. And I've seen some reviews where people say that they think the 2 women aren't particularly interesting. I really thought they were, and I thought the commentary on the way women were viewed at the time and the way men were viewed at the time. Like, for example, when this case goes to trial, because the husband is this really attractive man, loads of women come to the courtroom to hear about this grisly crime just because he's so attractive, and they think this is almost this really romantic story, and he must be innocent. So yeah, I thought this was really interesting. I thought it had great commentary on gender roles at the time, and just the sheer sexism that society had. And I think when we think about sexism and all the effects it has on women in society over the years, we don't necessarily think of crimes as one of the top ways in which that would have had a really detrimental effect. When you read this book, it's so clear that so few women would have got a fair trial, whether they were the victim or the perpetrator, or the person being accused, I should say, because the justice system was just so clearly sexist, and the jury was so sexist. And yeah, so I had a great time reading this, and definitely want to continue to read books that are like literary fiction in writing style, but still have an element of crime attached. So do recommend me some books like that, please. Then I'm going to talk about the first book I read in March, which is the book I didn't really enjoy. I'll sandwich my least favourite amidst all the other ones I enjoyed. And that was Brutes by Diz Tate. So this was one I was always a bit dubious about. I'd put on my anticipated releases video, as I had with a lot of books in this video actually, because a lot of these are books that just came out. And I said in the video I was interested in it because it is told from the perspective of 5 young girls growing up in a poor area of Florida, I think in the 90s from memory, and it is told in the collective we, and it's about another young girl who's gone missing and like their reactions to that. And I thought that sounded really interesting, but I also thought that it had the chance to be that sort of cold, detached writing style I don't really enjoy, and maybe that element of, I find quite often when a writer has a cold, detached sort of clinical style, they also tend to try and make us be disgusted by like just normal bodily functions, which I always think reads as like quite mean-spirited. And I felt like from the blurb this book had a chance of being like that, which I think it was a bit. Like the writing style, a lot of traumatic stuff is happening in this book, but the writing style does hold you at a distance, and I think that could be purposeful in terms of these young girls are trying to stop themselves from looking too closely at the awful things they're living through. So I think a lot of this book was really intentional. I think it would be a really interesting book to talk about in like a book club or something. There's a lot to unpack, and actually when I finished the book I probably had more fun thinking about it and piecing it together than I did actually reading it, because this book has lots of sort of fabulous elements which I didn't enjoy. Me back in 2015 would have probably loved this book. I went through a phase where I loved fabulous fiction, and now I just don't. Usually as soon as anything weird enters a book, like for example there's discussions in this book that there could be like a monster that lives in the lake sort of thing, like a Loch Ness monster type creature, and I was just like, nah. But like when you finish the book, all these weird things clearly symbolise stuff, and it's all really interesting, but I just don't really enjoy it. I also felt, and there's 2 ways you can look at this, okay? So I'll tell you the sort of generous way you can look at it and the way that I think is probably true. The majority of this book is told in the collective we from the perspective of these girls in the 90s, but interspersed with that there are chapters from them as older women, and in fact they call themselves the girls, but one of them is a boy, and we also get a chapter from him when he's a man. All these adults, to me, read very, I hate saying this word, similarly. I always trip over it because I talk too fast. Yeah, they all sounded like the same person. So the generous way of viewing that is like the author's trying to have some sort of commentary that like they've all been through this collective trauma, and because of that they all end up being sort of as repressed and in a way sort of immature as one another. And the not generous way to view that is the author's just not very good at writing distinct characters. Because one of these chapters, I think the woman is a waitress, and she talks about the fact that she's a bigger woman, and some of the points she makes about the way in which she like moves her body through the restaurant and the way in which she is viewed by the customers, I thought was really well done. Like that was my favourite bit of the novel. As a short story, I would read that and find it really powerful. But it's lessened, the impact is lessened by the fact that all the adults read like that. And when you remove the element of this one woman being like slightly bigger than the rest, like they're just like the same. And so to me, I think that's more because the author just wasn't very good at writing these distinct voices. So yeah, this was a 2-star read for me. I should have DNF'd it, it just wasn't for me at all. But I finished it because there was a little crime element sort of, pulling me through, and also because it was so short. But I should have just DNF'd. And the next book is, I think, the only book I've read that's been longlisted for the Women's Prize. I heard people talk about this in their predictions videos, and I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. So I requested it, which was lucky because I requested it at the library, I should say. which was lucky because then it did get longlisted and loads of people have requested it, but I was like first in the queue, so I need to get this back to the library very quickly. And that is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin. So I have quite conflicted views on this. I read this book in 2 sittings, I think across like one day. It's a very short book, it's around 200 pages, very big, widely spaced font, and that is one of my criticisms. I think the book is too short for what it's trying to do. However, I think this is a successful debut novel. I will definitely pick up what this author reads next. But yeah, I think this is, like I said, trying to do too much. So, premise. This book opens in the late 70s in Vietnam, and we are following a family of 6 children and the mother and father. They are trying to flee Vietnam. They're first going to go on a boat and get to Hong Kong, and then their plan is to get from Hong Kong to the US, where their uncle lives with his family. They decide to go on 2 separate boats. So the 3 older children, who are like 11, 12 and the 15-year-old daughter, are on one boat, and then the 3 young children and the parents go on the next boat. What we find pretty quickly in this book is that the second boat with the younger children and the parents doesn't make it. And so interspersed with the older daughter's narrative, we also hear a narrative from her young brother Dao as a ghost. And he is like watching over them as they're in these refugee camps, and like what happens to them. And also interspersed with those 2 narratives is like a third voice, which is almost like newspaper articles about some of the real life events that happened during the Vietnamese War, and then also happened in the UK to do with Margaret Thatcher just being absolutely awful at accepting Vietnamese refugees, because these 3 children go from Hong Kong to the UK. So my criticisms are, I think that you could have felt a bit more attached to the sister and her 2 brothers. I think that because there's not many pages here and there's so much happening, I cared for them in that clearly their story is devastating, but I didn't like super connect to them in that they didn't feel like fully fleshed out characters. They felt more like individuals who are inhabiting these actions, and they felt the way you would assume most people would feel if they were going through those things. But yeah, they just didn't feel like fully fleshed out characters to me. So I felt for them, but not as much as I wanted to. And then my second criticism of this book is that I've heard lots of people, and I've seen lots of reviews where people are saying this is like a 5-star read because, oh my God, it's so emotional and it was so devastating. But what I always try and do as a reader is, when you're reading a book that's about real life events, if you learn about a historical event that you didn't know about and you think, fucking hell, that is horrific, are you actually emotionally impacted by the real thing that happened or by the way the author portrays it? Because if it's by the real thing that happened, like, the author shouldn't get like plaudits for that, because they haven't it happened, they haven't made that up. If it's the way that they portray it to you, then great. But my issue is, if I come across something in a book that I don't know anything about, I always go and look into it online. And there were quite a few historical events in this book that I didn't know about, and every time I looked into them, the first newspaper article that came up, the chapter was pretty much a simplified version of that newspaper article, down to the point where some of the sentences were nearly word for word the same. So I just don't think that should factor into how successful a novel is, because that's not really the author. That's like real life. So I enjoyed this book, and I would definitely read what the author wrote next. But yeah, I do always try, and I think you have to separate how you feel about real life events from how they're portrayed in fiction, because something shouldn't just have merit because it was a real thing that happened and it was devastating. So yeah, enjoyed this. We'll read what she reads next, but I think she has a way to go. I think her next books will be even better than this. So there is that. And the next book I'm going to talk about is a short story collection that I pre-ordered because I read The Office of Historical Corrections by this author, I think last year, and I really enjoyed it. And that book is Before You Suffocate Your Own Full Self, which is an excellent title, by Danielle Evans. This was a short story collection published in, I think, 2010 in the US, and it's only just been picked up in the UK. So I'm super happy to have been able to read this. This has 8 short stories in it. 4 of them were 5-star reads for me. The other 4 were like 3.5, 4-star reads. This was a really strong collection. I will read anything this author brings out. I think she only has those 2 short story collections out, but I would, yeah, if she had a novel come out, I'd be like so excited, but also for another short story collection. She is a master of her craft. I feel in such safe hands. These are the type of writers I'm really bad at describing, but sometimes I come across a writer where when I read their words, I can't put into words why they're so excellent, but they just are. There's not a single sentence in this book where I'm like, oh, like that didn't quite sit right, or like that word should be moved there, or like, oh, you know, she doesn't do anything wrong. She doesn't make any errors, and she does a really great job of both types of short stories, right? So obviously there's things that sit somewhere in the middle, but what short stories are great at doing on opposite ends of the scale are either giving you these quite tight narratives where you follow a really short period of time and an event happens that sort of could change the direction of somebody's life, or could be a moment they always remember. Or the other version is watching an event or a series of events have an effect on a character's life. So seeing that unfold over many years. And she does those 2 things in the first 2 stories in this collection, looking at similar themes, and they're both brilliant. So the first story is called Virgins and the second is called Snakes. In the first story, you're looking at the short time span. You sort of follow one evening with these 2 teenage girls, these best friends. One of them is wanting to sort of take control of her body, and she wants the boys at school to think she's like fun and rebellious, and so she's sort of pushing the boundaries of what she's allowed to do. Whereas our protagonist is the opposite of that. She wants to be safe, she doesn't want to rebel, and it's about them going on one night out and the actions of her friend sort of pushing our protagonist into a situation she doesn't want to be in. I thought it was just absolutely brilliantly written. And the second story, Snakes, is about a young girl who was sent to stay with her white grandmother in a southern state in the US for the summer, and her white cousin is also there. Her grandmother is very racist and lives in a really racist community, and so treats them really differently. And it's about, she instills this fear of snakes in our protagonist, which causes her to have a horrific summer in the south. And this event happens, this sort of violent event, which changes our protagonist's life, but also changes the way she feels about her parents for leaving her with her grandmother, and yeah, just sort of changes the way in which she views herself. And I thought those stories being put beside one another was like a brilliant choice. They were both so well done. And I think something she also does really well is, you know, in large part, if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know that I prefer to read from the perspective of women, but when she does write from the perspective of men, she also does that really, really well. One of my favourite stories in this collection was from the perspective of a returned American soldier, and about how sort of bleak and desperate his life looks, and some sort of bizarre decisions he makes because of that have some serious consequences. And yeah, I just thought it was really excellently written. There's a bit I've tabbed in this because I think what she's particularly good at, I love you know, coming of age perspectives, especially from young girls. I've said this a million times. And we have a few stories like that in this collection. They feel really unique and different. They don't feel like, oh, same stuff again. But I tabbed a paragraph that I thought exemplified how brilliant her writing is, but also how good she is at writing about what it's like to move through the world as a girl and as a woman, when your body, especially as a young black girl, when your body is so sort of looked at as something that can sort of publicly be commented on. So I thought this was really amazing. I waited for shouts or sirens, but none came, so I followed her lead, matching her stride and imagining my steps clicked like hers. Our bravado peeled a little as we crossed the parking lot and avoided looking up at the men who hung out in front of the store all day, looking for work or drinking or both. It was after 3, so the hope of day work had mostly faded and the drinking was in full swing. They grunted appreciatively at the bodies we hadn't quite figured out what to do with yet, and we shrank into ourselves at their catcalls as if blushing would make our breasts and behinds less prominent. On the next block we were cool again, walked tall and touched mailboxes and fence posts and other things that weren't ours. Gina lit a cigarette and I watched her smoke. Yeah, I just think that's absolutely brilliant, and she gets across so much in so few words there. I really enjoyed this collection and would be interested to hear if you read it and what stories you enjoyed in particular. Then I have the final two books to talk about, and they're both non-fiction. Firstly, the one I listened to on audio is Life in the City of Dirty Water, a memoir of healing by Clayton Thomas Mueller. I had sort of mixed feelings about this memoir because I think it's slightly confused. So the author is an Indigenous activist, and he is telling you the story of his sort of childhood and adolescence. He lived a very sort of difficult childhood. There is a lot of intergenerational trauma that really sort of plays out in his life. He lives around a lot of poverty and a lot of violence, and he ends up getting involved in drugs and sort of gang work and stuff like that. And then the book is sort of a book of two halves. It then sort of moves into how he got involved into environmental activism and talks about that. And I'm sort of unsure how this book was put together, because I think that separately the two halves are pretty good, but it's when you join the two halves you sort of lose the strength of this memoir, because in the first section, like I said, it's really focused on his childhood and teenage years, and it really explores all that. But then in the second section, it just feels like an entirely different book. He talks about a lot of names. There's a lot of acronyms of like these different charities and what they're trying to achieve. And it's very much like, and then I met this person, and then I got this job, and then I went to here. And it just feels like he's trying to fit in this long list of his like CV. So it feels quite different to the first section. Something else I also struggled with in this book is that, and I find this quite often with memoirs, I'm not sure if this book was written from start to finish to be one book together, because like it feels like I guess this didn't work for me in the way it was structured, because as an example, he mentions his wife at certain points throughout the memoir. He met her and he was quite young. They've been married for many, many years. So he'll sort of like mention, there's a scene where he's talking about being involved in gang crime as a sort of young man. And he says, this girl I was dating, and he just casually mentions her name and like helped me get out of this gang crime. But he doesn't go into anything else about her. It's just like an aside. But then in later chapters, he'll go back in time to meeting her, and you'll find out that's the woman he married, and you'll find out how important she is to his life. But like she's still not the larger part of that chapter. But then there's a chapter that's entirely about her and sort of dedicated to her, in which he repeats things. He tells you the year he met her again, and I'm like, well, you've already told us this. And that happens a few times where like he'll repeat information to you like he hasn't said it to you before, which always makes me think, was this chapter written to be an essay in like a different publication, and you've now sort of pulled all these different threads together to become a memoir? Because I always just think you should rewrite those sections, because as someone reading it as one piece, what's happening is it's pulling me out of the narrative, because you're talking to me like you haven't already told me this, and you have. And also like, it just feels, I don't care how someone structures their memoir. I think you can get a really interesting story out of doing it chronologically, but you can also get some really interesting discussions out of looking at events thematically. But I think he somehow loses on both parts because it's just a bit jumbled. And like I said, the second half, I felt like I was given a lot of information about his career, because he's done a lot, like he's amazing, the things he's done, but also not enough information to entirely understand like what was happening. This book is quite short, and he has a really big career, expansive career, and it just felt like we were jumping. And I was just a bit confused by how he got there. So I think if you pick this up for his early years, you might find that there's not enough of that. And if you pick this up for the stuff about environmental activism, then there's definitely, that isn't clear and cohesive enough. So I still enjoyed this. He narrates himself on audio, and I think he did a really good job of that. But yeah, for me, this felt like he was trying to do too many things and hadn't quite figured out how he wanted to put it down on paper. And so just was a little bit jumbled in the end. And then lastly, and I could talk about this book for ages, so I'm going to try not to, I have Run Towards the Danger, Confrontations with the Body of Memory by Sarah Polley, I think is how you say it. I was saying Sarah Polley, but I've heard a lot of people say Sarah Polley. So I had Jill talk about this over at the Book Bully, and like just seeing that name, I was like, I don't know who this person is. I since do. She is now known more as like a screenwriter and a director, but she was an actress as a girl and sort of a young woman. She most recently wrote and directed Woman Talking, which was adapted from the book by Miriam Taves. And I just went to see that at the cinema, and then I was like, you know what? I want to read this book just after seeing that, because I think it will like add more to it, having just experienced some of her work. And actually I've seen loads of her films and really enjoyed them all. So I sort of followed her career without knowing it. This is a collection of, I think, 6 essays, and it is brilliant. I'm going to do a really rubbish job of talking about this one. So the author has had quite a crazy life, let's put it that way. And she says in the I think in the introduction, that this book both makes her life come across as sort of more horrific, but also less, because there's more things that have happened to her that she hasn't included, but she's also included some of the worst stuff. So it's sort of, you know, the balance. There's much more to her life than these 6 essays. But what these 6 essays have to offer is so fascinating, and in large part what these 6 essays share thematically is the discussion of what trauma, we always talk about what trauma does to our minds and what it does to somebody's mental health, but a lot of these essays are focused on if trauma isn't dealt with and it affects our mental health, at which point does it then start to affect our physical health as well? And I find that really interesting on a personal level, because you may know this if you've watched my channel for a while. I was diagnosed in late 2020 with something called functional neurological disorder, and I was told that a functional neurological disorder is usually caused because you're like repressing past trauma, and because you're repressing it to a certain level, your body wants you to deal with it, and so causes physical pain as like a warning system. It's quite interesting how sort of intelligent, also unhelpful a body can be. But anyway, so it made me sort of in particular interested in this. And that, yeah, this is really interesting. And as well as discussions about the ways in which a body can physically show trauma, this is also a discussion about memory and the way in which people who are both at an event can have different memories of that event, which I think also has a lot to do with the way in which we carry trauma, because so much of trauma is to do with the way in which you perceive an event to have happened, and then the impact that event has on you and the story you then tell about yourself because of that event. And it can be soul crushing if somebody has a different version of that event to you, but also really illuminating. It can be helpful or entirely not helpful. And I think these are all really complicated and nuanced discussions, which she entirely does justice to. So I could run on about this forever, and I think this would be such a fascinating book to talk about in a book club, to even like have 1 week per essay, and then like what sort of 1 book club meeting per essay, and then a final meeting to sort of talk about what the essays say to one another, because I just think there's so much to unpack here. But if I just sort of focus briefly on the things that really stood out to me, is one, there's lots of discussions in this about Sarah being a child actor. She started as young as sort of like 5, I think. And there's a lot of discussion about the decisions her parents made and the sort of danger that adults allowed her to be placed in order to make a good TV show or a good film. And there's one essay in particular in this collection, let me double check the title, called Mad Genius, which is about a film she was in, which was sort of like an action film, which was like a really dangerous set to be on for a child and really terrifying. And that one is really interesting in terms of the way she remembers certain events, and the way in which that has made her as an adult like really susceptible to noise and to being a highly anxious person in loud surroundings and things like that, and how she then talks to people who worked on the set, both people who she felt put her in danger and people who also didn't really have an active decision in that because of sort of how low down they were on the pecking order within the film crew. And the different responses she gets to that. And in talking about that, she's talking about the amount of parents who contact her now and say, oh, my child wants to be an actor, we've been offered this really great opportunity, what are your thoughts? And the fact that out of like all the parents who have ever spoken to her, only 2 parents have actually taken on board what she said, because what most people want to hear is, yeah, do it, because they want the fame and the money and the prestige that comes from their child being an actor. She makes some excellent points in that chapter. You know, when one of the parents asks her about it, she's like, and they're like, but they want to act, they're brilliant at it, like they want to act. She's like, well, children at 6 want to be doctors, but we don't let them because they're not old enough to take on that responsibility. Like, how is this any different? And also, you know, the hours these children work and like what should be done with the money they earn. Like, this was, when I read I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy, I had all these questions come up and I didn't think she delved into any of them enough or really unpacked them. And this book, if you want that itch scratched, this book really, really does do that. But it does so much more. The first essay is about her when she's around 15, acting in a theatre production of Alice in Wonderland, in which she is Alice. And it is around the time when she has to have major surgery on her back to realign her spine, and she's living in intense pain. And it's a really interesting moment where she says that she doesn't want to do the play anymore, and so she, in her mind, exaggerates her pain to try and be able to take some time off. But then when she talks to like the medical professionals, they tell her that like she isn't exaggerating her pain, like it 100% is that bad. So it's like her brain has like repressed the pain enough that she's had to then convince herself that she's lying about the pain to take time off. Like, it's just fascinating. And I only tabbed like 2 tiny sections in this book, which would make you think this isn't a 5-star read for me. But the reason I tabbed so little is because if I'd have started tabbing, I would have tabbed every page. This is brilliantly written, brilliantly examined. Another essay is about like the Me Too movement, which sort of, there was a case that went forward in Canada a few years before the Me Too movement really took off and actually went completely the other direction, and that the man accused got away with it. And again, it's this discussion about the fact that this man had sexually assaulted the author, and she doesn't come forward at the time. And she talks about why she didn't come forward. And it is, you know, this emotionally devastating essay to read, but also so nuanced. And I find that it's a discussion that is a really difficult one to have without somehow causing offence and feeling like you've let other victims down because you haven't come forward. But she handles it all with such grace that you can imagine her sitting in a room with multiple people impacted by this man's actions, and like none of them feeling like they could really have a go, because she's entirely empathetic of everybody's circumstances and everybody's choices and actions, but also so clear in her own confusion that you can't, like, I think that's what is fascinating in all these essays. She's so upfront about how complicated dealing with trauma is, that you really feel like at no point does she there's a lack of information or there's any unanswered questions, or that if you were to have a discussion with her, I don't feel like anything would get like awkward or like confrontational, because I don't know, she's just so thought out. It feels like she's mined the deepest cavities of her mind when writing these essays, so much so that like it feels at once clear and yet still confused, because how can you not, it's impossible to deal with some traumas, right? And it will take hundreds of hours of therapy to entirely understand how you feel about something, but yet she manages to sort of relay how she's felt at multiple moments. Yeah, this is great. And she points out that some of these essays took her years to write, which you can really tell, like the amount of thinking and reflection in each of these essays is so apparent. I just loved it, and I will definitely be buying my own copy and rereading it, because, and I feel like I still haven't done it justice. It is absolutely fantastic. Please read it. I would look up trigger warnings for this. Like I said, there is definitely trigger warnings for sexual assault, also just general like children being put in danger and neglect. There's also an essay that is focused on struggling to conceive and miscarriages, and also like just the incredibly difficult pregnancy, which is a very difficult section to read about, and also like a brilliant essay, a loss of a parent. That, yeah, this is got a lot of upsetting content, but I think it handles all that content really well, and is always aware of the trauma of those events, so nothing feels gratuitous or like, I don't know, just it's excellent. So yeah, I'm so glad I heard Jill recommend this, and yeah, would love to see more people talk about it. So yeah, that is my final book. So yeah, I definitely should have done a mid-month wrap up, because I fear this video is incredibly long, but didn't get around to it. I will try and do that in the future. I always say that. But yeah, I feel like I had a really great reading month overall. Nearly everything was just like really enjoyable, and even if I didn't love them all, there was still a lot to unpack and to think about. And my reading touched on a lot of themes that I really enjoy. So like I said, I would love recommendations for sort of more literary fiction books that have an element of crime or like mystery, especially when they're dealing with bigger themes, like I said, with I Have Some Questions For You, that was focused on like who has the right to tell the story of a crime, and also like how we portray both the victim and the accused. And Other Women, like I said, was like a historical reflection on how sexism would have affected the wider public's perception of a crime, and like who was at fault. And then I really loved the boarding school narrative, and I Have Some Questions For You. And obviously with Run Towards the Danger, I am just deeply fascinated by the way in which our mind works in connection to trauma and memory. So any books that deal with those topics, please, please, please feel free to recommend them to me. And yeah, I would love to chat about the books down below. I'd love to chat about what you read in March and like what you particularly enjoyed or didn't enjoy. Always interested to hear. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.